I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening. My name is Ross and I'll be doing the month of Mondays in June, this very cold June. So thank you for rugging up and coming out. I'm going to be presenting some basic meditation techniques, and I'm presenting them in a way that doesn't require any sort of ideological or spiritual or kind of faith commitment. So I want everyone to relax and feel that no matter where they are, in whatever sort of circumstance, there'll be something hopefully of value in these techniques that can be applied directly in our lives. So it's very, very useful to think of meditation in this way as taking the essence of our lives. And we're going to start with a meditation that is extremely simple, and some of us will know the meditation very well, on the breath. And the choice of this object is very, very special because it's in some important way a transparent object. It doesn't come with any conceptual baggage. All we attempt to do in this meditation is barely observe. And there's a huge amount of meaning in that word barely. We merely observe. We don't think about how we're observing, whether we're observing sort of in a great way today or a bad way today. We don't overlay the process of being aware of the breath with a whole lot of intellectual fuss and befuddlement. We let all of our usual conceptual riotous activity subside. Just let it go and merely focus on the bare awareness of the breath. And so it sounds remarkably simple, and it is remarkably simple, but it's almost as though the very simplicity of the technique triggers a kind of habitual reaction on our own part, so that we flood the scene of the meditation with a whole lot of garbage and distraction. So for the purposes of this meditation, any thought that distracts us and carries us away from our bare awareness of the object is simply let go, no matter how compelling that thought is. So some of us will have the experience of being self-seductive. We'll have a couple of idle thoughts, seeing we can let them go quite easily, and then we'll kick in with a really good one that will grab our attention so successfully that we'll start a journey, a narrative, in other words, that will be so compulsive, so compelling, so habitually ingrained in our usual runaway mental activity that we won't recognise even that we've lost our object, the breath. So in the frame of this meditation, the first second, if you like, of losing our awareness of the breath is the very first moment of distraction. So the very first thought that has the capacity to make us forget the object is the first moment when our awareness of our object has collapsed or broken down. So this is going to happen frequently in the flow of the meditation. This in itself is inevitable and not a problem, but there is a skill required. We have to pick our awareness up and return it to our primary chosen object, the breath. And the sooner and the more efficiently, the more sort of effectively we do that, the more organically will the meditation flow. So sometimes if we're very distracted, we need to be jumping in a lot to check, and other times we'll find that we'll have a very good concentration, and on those occasions we don't have to overly invest in checking whether the mind has wandered. So an analogy is given here, a very classic analogy in the Buddhist sutras, which is of a lion, elephant, that's a wild elephant that is being tamed. And in order to tame a wild elephant, the same as a horse, you have to tether them. And if you hold the tether too tightly, the elephant will feel constricted and frightened and angry, and will use all of its power and might to burst off the rope. And you can imagine how powerful an elephant is when it decides to break away from its moorings. And if the rope's too loose, the elephant has no sense that it's being trained. It doesn't notice it's any different from everyday life. So this is an analogy for the way we have to hold the object, neither too tightly, because if we're too tight it will cause stress and in fact excitement. We'll get kind of agitated rather than calm. We think, crikey, this guy's teaching meditation, but I'm feeling really, really restless. It's because we're stressing, we're squeezing the meditation with such urgency that we're sort of strangulating the kind of expansive relaxation that we're actually seeking. However, if we're too nonchalant, too carefree, too casual about our object, a little bit too easy, then we're not going to discipline the mind and improve its capacity to hold the object. So there's two aspects to holding the object. One is that we hold it continuously, and the other is that we hold it vividly. And this vividness is also very important, because a lot of us will have had the experience of doing this meditation and then only to find that as the meditation unfolds, we sink into a kind of stupor. Torpor? Has anyone had that experience? It's a kind of heavy, inert experience of not even going to sleep. It's more lethargic. It's like we've had a drug overdose, some terrible overdose of painkillers or something. We're just submerged under this sheer weight that we're sort of fighting to get to the surface of consciousness. This is a sign that we've gone too far in a kind of not checking the clarity of the object. So if we find that we're getting very, very heavy and kind of like this, we have to tighten our attention and intensify the clarity. So we'll discover with experience that we can actually re-clarify a murky object. We just make it more fresh, more vivid, more aware, more direct. And so we'll find that we have that capacity to do that. And rather amusingly, perhaps, we have this capacity endlessly when it comes to desire objects. Because if I mention, the most beautiful slice of cake, the mind starts to vividly evoke that experience and becomes more and more intense. That's what craving is, isn't it? We can visualise very, very acutely when we're connected to a desire object. So the mind can do this, but when we're meditating on the breath, because it's a neutral object, we don't have this kind of ordinary sensory stimulation that we're used to. We don't charge ourselves in the usual manner. And so in a way we're wandering out of our depth quite quickly. We're wandering out of our usual habitual mode of being. And so this is why we have to suspend any acute expectation in the meditation, because we will naturally move into it if we simply apply the technique. So in the analogy of the elephant tied to the stake with a rope, the stake is the meditation object, i.e. the breath. It can be other objects, but in this meditation it's the breath. The rope is mindfulness. Now this word has been, or is now sort of entering popular discourse in every direction. I read the other day that the army is training in mindfulness to improve performance on the battlefield under stressful conditions. I don't think the Buddha ever thought of mindfulness having that outcome, but it probably works, by the way. So that's just what way it is. But it's a very, very loaded term. Buddhism has been asked to do lots of things in contemporary popular culture. But for our purposes, it's referring to the capacity of our mind to recollect our meditation object. So to recollect the meditation object. To be aware again of the object that we were just aware of in the immediate preceding moment. By remembering what that object was that we just had in our awareness, in the next moment, we develop a continuity of awareness. It's remarkable. From moment to moment, we can latch those moments together in a continuous flow if we combine it with mindfulness, this active remembering. So it's not remembering in this sort of nostalgic, going back into early childhood sense. It's simply being aware of what we were just aware of in the immediately preceding moment. The moment we forget to remember the object is the moment when we have a space for distraction to interrupt and carry us away. Simple. So, to take that analogy again of the elephant at some point will have a rider on it, and the rider will have, in traditional sort of elephant training techniques, a sort of a metal pole with a hook on it, and it will use that to sort of goad the elephant, poke it, to discipline it, the same way that a jockey uses a whip in a horse race. And the aim is not to be cruel to the elephant, but to have some direct way of influencing the elephant's behaviour by saying, look, turn left, not right. Go faster, go slower. So this kind of capacity to discipline, if you like, or to check and then correct, is carried out by an aspect of the mind which is called discriminating alertness. And this mind is not the same as mindfulness because it has a different kind of economy. It almost free floats. It appears and applies itself out of nowhere and then disappears back into nowhere. It's checking from time to time in the body of the flow of mindfulness, is the mind on its object? It has this fundamental question, only one question, is the mind on its object? If it is, it immediately withdraws, leaving no trace. It has incredibly light footsteps. If we have wandered, it picks the mind up, the awareness, and returns it to the breath, and then we remember it again in the next moment with mindfulness. So it's restored the meditation flow. If we over-apply discriminating alertness by being too zealous, too rigorous, too anxious to check, it will become its own distraction. And if we don't apply it enough, we'll have a break in our mindfulness. So there's a real skill to be learnt here between balancing mindfulness and the operation of discriminating alertness. So discriminating alertness is sometimes described as a spy peeping in. As if someone came to that door outside this gompa and ever so slightly opened the door and peered in so that no one in this room noticed, but they were able to see exactly what was happening in this room, and then quietly withdrew, closed the door so that no one heard them leave. That is a perfect analogy for discriminating alertness. So are there any questions coming from that brief description? So let's try it then. We're going to precede the meditation, as is traditional, with a motivation which is designed to soften the mind. And when I say soften, I mean to enlarge the scope of our purpose in meditating. And so as meditators, we recognise that we have this capacity to look after ourselves through meditation, but that also there's a responsibility to look after and protect others as well. So we make a kind of internal commitment as a meditator, not just to meditate for this one, I, this one, me, which is often our focus in everyday life, so often our focus. But we think, how wonderful it would be if I could develop a magnanimous, universal concern for all others. And for that reason, I wish to bring sort of calm, harmony to my own mind so that I might better be able to become a responsible global citizen. We haven't got too many of those happening in England at the moment, have we? Following Mr. Trump's visit to London. He's wreaking havoc on a global scale, that man, because his mind, what one suspects, is very much out of control. So there is a kind of sense in which we are, in a very real way, responsible for what we're doing with our minds, whether it's a weapon or a sort of a tool of benefit for others, depends on us. So I'm going to do this motivation by using the 4 immeasurable thoughts. And this is a classic framework, and it has each of the 4 immeasurables has 3 steps in it. And each of those steps involves an increasing commitment to the purpose of the thought. So this will become obvious when we're doing it. But the third one, from a classical Buddhist perspective, is to seek the Buddha's blessings that we might be able to carry out the aspiration that's made in the particular immeasurable thought. So I'm asking here, or inviting you, to substitute whatever source of inspiration you might like. So I might say, please Buddha, inspire me thus. You might wish to have Jesus or God, or you might look at it from an atheistic perspective and say my better self or my potential. Whatever it is that works for you, use in that moment, because the technique will work perfectly well with that adjustment. So I invite us now to draw our minds inward, subtracting our minds from our daily affairs. Just letting go of all of the engagements, involvements, busyness, clutter that has preoccupied our day. And it's actually remarkable that we can be sitting here quietly in this safe place at this moment in time with each other. So just relish that opportunity, acknowledging it for what it is, how special our current situation is, even if we take it for granted. Then we generate from the depths of our heart the first immeasurable thought, thinking how wonderful it would be if all beings without exception lived in a state of equanimity, free from holding some close and others distant. How wonderful this would be. May I be able to bring this about? Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. May all beings, without exception, have happiness and the causes of happiness. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. How wonderful it would be if all beings, without exception, were freed of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they be free of suffering and its causes. I myself will free them from suffering and its causes. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. May all beings, without exception, achieve ultimate happiness, liberation, stable goodness. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddhas, inspire me thus. Now we become aware of the breath, just as flowing as it is. We don't seek to control it. Just becoming aware of it at some point in the body. But it might be at the point of the nostrils, for example. Just becoming aware of the breath flowing in, the breath flowing out. Being aware of the beginning, middle and end portion of an in-breath, the beginning, middle and end portion of the out-breath, even the beginning, middle and end of the space between. So just as we might rest a feather on a wind, so that wherever the wind goes, the feather goes. Feel that wherever the breath goes, at this point at least in the body, just resting the mind upon the breath and stabilising, holding it gently, being aware of the breath flowing. So we just check, is the mindfulness upon the breath? Are we remembering the breath? If not, bring our attention back to the breath and resume the meditation. If we're daydreaming, this is distraction. Return to the breath. Just checking. If we're becoming sluggish, we need to tighten our awareness. Or if we're feeling very excited, agitated, we need to relax and just ease into the meditation. Lean against the object, the breath, as we might lean into the wind. Just checking. So for the last moments or minutes of the meditation, see if we can enhance the clarity of our awareness, apprehending the breath more vividly. Clearly. precisely. Now we let go of the breath as our object, just becoming aware very quietly, gently of our body. We can gently open our eyes if they're being shut. It's possible to have your eyes open when you meditate. It seems a bit startling to some people, but in some of the meditation traditions it's actually recommended that we do. So you might wonder why. And one of the main reasons is that it's much less likely that we'll sink into sleep or drowsiness. But if we do keep the eyes open, we're not sort of like this so much as where we just keep the eyelids relaxed and allow light to enter. So we're not attempting to read the landscape of our vision, what's actually appearing through the eyes. We just simply allow light to enter. So we're not paying attention, in other words, to what we're focusing on. So are there any questions that spring from the experience of the meditation? Any thoughts or quandaries you might have? Yep.
I find your voice particularly sleepy.
That's no good. I'll have to speak faster next week.
It's very relaxing.
Yeah, it's not meant to be a hypnagogic, trance-inducing voice. Yeah, it's interesting. Is that okay? Yeah. Hypnosis is different to meditation because we're not losing awareness. So it's the precise opposite of hypnosis in that regard. I'm not saying anything negative about hypnosis here, but I'm saying it's a different process. It's operating with the unconscious mind. In meditation, we're operating with the conscious mind. And in an important way, we're befriending our conscious mind. We're trying to be able to sit with it. A lot of people, when they start to meditate, almost physically jump up and say, I can't do this. It's unbearable. It's just, can't do it. I'm trying really hard, and I've tried before, and it's just kind of really, really difficult to sit. That's why in the end I invited us just to sit quietly in our bodies. How extraordinary is that? That it's such a big deal to sit quietly in our bodies. How many of us have sat quietly in our bodies today? A few people. Wonderful. Do you do it on a regular basis? Yeah. You're doing yoga? Yeah, exactly. You find all those techniques in yoga. And it has many, many benefits, doesn't it? Yeah. Particularly when we're emotionally dishevelled, panicking, distraught, even depressed. It can be very good to sit quietly and just be with what's there. And it sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because if you're anxious, you think by sitting, somehow you get inundated by the problem that was in your mind. But it seems to be the case that that intensity disperses if the body's relaxed and we're allowing ourselves to be present in the moment. So I'm not saying it's an instant remedy for those problems, but it's a different way of working, because normally when we're distressed or upset or fraught, dishevelled, we run desperately for some kind of aid or assistance, rescue remedy. And for some of us, unfortunately, it will be alcohol or binge eating or watching 10 hours non-stop of Netflix, serials, or whatever it is that works for us, sometimes in grotesque combinations of all of those three things. And whatever, like these are real kind of habitual responses. And so the bareness of the technique again is a remedy in important ways, a different way of working with that habitual tendency to re-embroil ourselves in our habits that are often very constraining and even destructive. So if we develop a kind of capacity to be able to rest with bare awareness on the breath, we develop another kind of threshold, if you like, of our being. We experience ourselves like we might if we're doing yoga, it's a good example, in a much more relaxed and open way. And that experience of relaxed openness becomes the new yardstick, experiential yardstick, by which we can measure the degree of our agitation. Makes sense. If we're continually immersed in a mess, then we can't kind of work with it. But if we find a way of reaching a point of rest within that congestion, we can look back at the congestion and see it in its proportion, if you like. We get a perspective on our actual circumstance. We begin to be able to reflect creatively on our mental experience and begin to find ways of navigating with the feelings, emotions, experiences, thoughts and so forth that arise at the time of arising. And this is an incredibly pertinent skill that the meditator can develop, because it means that this mindfulness, this sort of awareness that we develop in meditation, flows naturally into the body of our everyday experience. We begin to experience the everyday differently, more acutely, more vividly, more coherently. Plus we're more open to what is actually occurring. We're able to see more. We're even able to see more about what's going on here in us, because we're not clinging to this tight, defensive, habitual, urgent structure that we're trying to maintain at all costs for fear that if we let go we're going to disintegrate. And so letting ourselves relax on the object through meditative stabilisation can bring about an increasingly deep state of open clarity that is profoundly restful just where it is in that place. And so the meditation cushion becomes, if you like, a doorway to an expansive other place that's not in defiance of this world, it's not rejecting this world, but it's enabling us to return to the world off our cushion, once we're standing up from a cushion, in a very, very unique, attuned way. So there are other techniques that we can use as well. We're not saying that this one technique is going to do everything, but it's a very important basis for developing a meditation practice. So I want to talk a little bit tonight also about another kind of meditation, which is called analytical meditation. And some of us will be aware of this. It's a form of meditation where we're not stabilising the mind on a single object, i.e. the breath, and holding it from moment to moment without letting it go or losing it and then having to pick it up again. We just did that one, that was the breathing meditation. We're doing another kind of meditation, which is a creative reflection, an investigation into our experience using conception. It's using the power of our intelligence as an analytical tool to begin to unravel the knot of habitual experience. And this is a technique that we should all have, and we can all learn, but it's not really provided in a Western materialist cultural context as something that's valuable or worthwhile. It's somehow slipped off the radar of contemporary society to a very large extent. And I think this is the reason why so many mindfulness technologies are sweeping into our culture, because they're acknowledging in an important way that we're not developing skills for personal insight to the same degree that we're hybridising and elaborating a hyper-technological, digital kind of cosmic, what's the word for it, a kind of constantly fascinating screen of activity that we can't look away from. So analytical meditation swings the attention in to our experience, but it utilises events and things that have happened in the outside world. So the technique we're going to look at today very briefly is called friend, enemy and stranger meditation, and it's a very profound meditation. It might sound a really simplistic one initially, but when we begin to do it, we realise how incredibly profound it is, because it's working on the premise, and it's an outrageous premise, which is that if we have friend, enemy and stranger in our lives, we don't have equanimity, which was that first immeasurable thought. If we hold onto some people tightly, possessively, and even desperately as our friend, and if we forcibly reject and spew out, often with rage or even violence, if you look at domestic violence here, and violence against women, it can be absolutely brutal in its manifestations, and people aren't worth even respecting. They can be abused, they can be crushed, they can be chopped up, they can be thrown away with disgust or anger or whatever emotion is charging that kind of event. Wars, for example. How on earth can you bomb children? What logic enables these sorts of acts to occur? In order to bomb children, we have to label enemy. We have a special enemy class. We see them as the threat, and therefore we bomb them. We generate permission to bomb them. Then there's a huge number of people who fall into a camp between the two extremes of friend and enemy, and they're strangers. And from a Buddhist psychological perspective, this is one of the most interesting categories because it includes most people. And it's also the shunting yard, if you like, for the other two categories. So we pluck people, if you like, from the stranger category to make them our friends. This is called befriending. And we know this from school kids. School kids befriend people in 5 minutes. They have a turnover of 100 in the course of a day. They go through friend, enemy and stranger faster than you can blink. As we get older, we tend to move a little bit slower, but perhaps with a little bit more deadly intent. We tend to put a lot more energy into, you're my friend and you're not going to move away from me because I love you and you're mine. And then there's the enemy who I think is the source of all my trouble. And then the stranger, says Buddhism, is estranged. We don't allow ourselves to think anything particularly of them. And this is really, really provocative. And I think that the best example of this is the walking past someone who is appearing as homeless. And we have that a lot in middle class, upper middle class Glenferrie Road now. Every day there are more homeless people on the street begging as the upper middle class shoppers buy their very expensive boutique clothing. And so there's a kind of tension there. And very few people stop to talk to those homeless people. Very few people walk near them. They detour. And if they do throw a coin, it's kind of like that as they pass, making sure that hopefully it gets in the hat, but not so that it's going to invite or invoke any conversation, perhaps. So I'm not saying, I'm exaggerating. I'm dealing here in stereotypes deliberately because we are dealing in stereotypes. We're forging and processing the mass of other beings all the time according to these three categories. And so from a Buddhist psychological perspective, we look a little bit deeper and we say that the friend, there's nothing wrong with having friends, by the way. I'm not criticising friendship. Friendship's the model that we might expand to cover all beings, ideally, but it doesn't work quite like that because we mix friendship with attachment. And there's nothing fixed in the stranger category that makes people irredeemably strange to us. Because as we know, it's often just a simple word from a stranger that starts a conversation that ushers them in to become our most dear friend. We've all had this experience, haven't we? You think how your friends have become your friends. It might have just been an idle act at some moment in time of offering you something, or maybe you're tripping over on a stairwell and they offered to help you from falling over and you said thank you, and then you started to talk, and then lo and behold, you became friends. So there's a kind of fluidity here, potentially, but we don't allow it to be fluid easily. So another provocative example is we have a friend who starts to change, but because of attachment, we can't bear the changed friend. They're threatening us with their change. We feel that they're no longer the person that we thought we were with. They're no longer the person we thought we wanted to be with. They're becoming strange to us. And so we can become coercive, we can become possessive, we can become manipulative, we can start to say, no, you can't go to CAE flower arranging classes 3 nights a week. I want you home with me. I don't want you to have another life. I don't want you going back to university. I don't want you having a job. I don't want you having that person as a friend who you see 4 times a week, etc., etc. You start to make demands and try to cut down the parameters of their freedom. And so this is a sign that attachment is pervading our model of friendship. And so Buddhism says that this mind of attachment is very, very powerful, and it makes us label certain people friends according to the extent to which they fulfil our desire. This is quite a shocking thought, isn't it? If someone pleases your desire, they become or can be seen as a friend. If someone opposes your desire, they become an enemy, a threat, a challenge. And if someone does neither, they remain a stranger. And so we're constantly juggling these three categories. And so we have an external juggle going on as we encounter in the world of society, and we have a corresponding internal chatter going on as we're getting thrown from desire, attachment, anger, resentment, and indifference. And these three powerful minds internally keep us always juggling restlessly. And so this equanimity meditation, for some of us might think, oh, this guy's talking rubbish, because if I don't have friends, you're saying I don't have friends, or I'm meant to love everyone equally, and how will I love my partner or my children, most special ones? If you're saying that everyone's equally lovable, aren't you robbing us of what makes us human? Is anyone thinking this? It's sort of understandable if we were. But Buddhism's going to say the opposite, that if we begin to break down these three categories, we begin to see people affectionately. We see them with affection. We begin to see who is there, in other words. Because we're not having to urgently lump them into one of these three categories. And so we, in a real sense, then we're able to befriend anyone and everyone. So that's the challenge of the technique. So let's do it now as a meditation, and it's going to be an experiential meditation. So I'm going to ask us to visualise three people, and guess what? One's going to be a friend, and it's a real friend, not a hypothetical friend. I want you to pick your real friend. And one's going to be your real enemy, and some people here are going to claim that they don't have enemies. Are there any of those here? There are always some. They're not admitting it tonight. But it's your least liked person. The one who, if you saw walk into this room, you go, oh no, not them again. How can I make my way around the work table so I can avoid them at the coffee machine, because I do not want to talk to that person today. That person will do perfectly fine for your enemy. And the stranger has to be an actual stranger. And it's interesting symbolically, isn't it, that I'm going to ask you to visualise a stranger, and most of us will find we can't visualise a stranger. And that's precisely why they're a stranger, because we've never even looked at them. We don't even know what colour hair they've got, probably. So I want you to try to pick an actual stranger. And one example I've got in my life is the chap that sells me a newspaper in the morning from a little kiosk, and he just sort of takes the money and hands you the newspaper. It's very difficult to draw into conversation. And I've been buying my newspaper from him for a number of years, and he was a stranger until I picked him for my stranger meditation. And the next day, you can believe this, I went to buy my paper and we had our first conversation. And I'm not saying we're best friends, but we're kind of friends. So this meditation isn't just hypothetical, it can transform and radically transform your life. And if anyone here is feeling isolated and lonely, this meditation is a very powerful way of beginning to work with that as well, because we can develop all sorts of confidences and sense of self-worth coming out of this meditation. So I can talk about that later. So let's pick our friend, put them in the space in front, facing towards us, as though they were right here, very close to us. Just as they are, their hair, their clothes, their posture, their face, their appearance, gestures. And as we do this, allow ourselves to determine what kinds of feelings arise in us as we contemplate our friend in this intimate manner. Not judging, we're simply trying to capture what's invoked when we think of our friend. What feelings are involved? If we like, we can enhance this investigation by picking a moment in time with this friend when they appeared even more our friend, most intensely our friend, when we really knew they were our friend. They somehow perhaps proved that they were our friend. How did it feel? Now place this person to one side, just gently, and in the space in front, visualize an enemy. Vividly invoke this person right in front of us, just as they are. As we do this, just quietly peruse our emotions, our thoughts, and come to some determination as to what kinds of feelings and thoughts are invoked. Honestly invoked here. We're not trying to prejudge ourselves, we're trying to witness what actually is involved in contemplating this enemy and come to some conclusion. How they make us feel. Perhaps if we're finding this unpleasant or difficult, this is precisely the point. Now move this person to the other side, and in the space in front visualize the stranger. With the same intensity and clarity that we visualize the friend and the enemy. And again, investigate what kinds of feelings and thoughts are involved or engaged as we contemplate the stranger. Now bring the three together in the space in front, friend, enemy and stranger, and just move from one to the next, to the next, to the next, in various orders and sequences, just exploring as we travel across them how the emotions, our responses shift. Or do they shift as we move from one to the next? So if we take a step back, just intellectually or conceptually, we can understand that this friend, this one, wasn't always our friend. There was definitely a moment, a prior moment, when they were a stranger. There's also no guarantee that they won't become a stranger. Our lives are filled with friends who have become strange. Or been estranged. Also, there are many friends who may have become our enemy. There's nothing to say that a friend can't become our enemy or be made into our enemy. And if we shift to the stranger, there's nothing to say that this stranger can't become our dearest friend or our enemy. Depends on circumstances. There's nothing to say that this enemy might not become a stranger or even our friend. So we can analyse these categories in great detail, which we're not going to do tonight, but for example, there may have been a point in time when our friend became our enemy, or at least according to our view. They were shunted from one category to the other. Or we might have shunted our friend into the stranger category. This happens all the time with relationship breakups. Sometimes we refuse to see someone again, even for the rest of their lives. So recognising that these three categories are being produced from our side through our projection, we try to even out our regard for them, feeling that the desire to be happy and not to suffer of each of these three beings is exactly equal. Therefore, it's inappropriate that we hold some close, some distant, or simply ignore others. And with that we conclude the meditation. It's setting up a kind of grammar or a kind of symbolic structure for the meditation, so it's really a matter of taking it into your own life. I was having a really rotten time with my boss at one stage at uni. She was creating a lot of problems for me, and I was dreading seeing her in the corridor as I made my way to my office. And I took her into my meditation deliberately to try to work with the work situation, and it really, really helped. Another experience, I'm just talking from my own experience here to sort of vivify what you can do with this technique. Another one is sometimes when someone's very, very ill in your life. This is a very common event. You reject them. You push them away. I heard a psychologist talk about this recently as sifting. She said that when people are diagnosed with terminal illnesses, so many people find that they are sifted by their friends. Have you heard about this? This idea of sifting. Meaning that a lot of your real friends suddenly aren't to be seen for the trees, for the woods. They've gone. You thought they were the ones you were going to rely on. They're not here anymore. They've fled. And if people you thought you were enemies come in with a cake and say, is there anything I can do to help? You thought, wait a minute. You're not meant to be doing this. You're my enemy. I don't know, I can't respond to this. This is challenging. Or someone who's a stranger will start to hand food over the back fence. This happened to my father in Yarrawonga when he was sick. His next door neighbour started making soup. And she literally handed it over the fence every day out of love for this man who she didn't really know, my father. And it was this extraordinary act of caring, which is really very moving to think about. So these are sorts of examples of how these meditations become very evocative. And so I'll just throw in, I'm conscious of the time, just throwing one last thought for this meditation. What if you apply it to yourself? Was anyone thinking that as I was talking about it? I was watching the ABC program on anorexia nervosa last night, and the woman in that who had anorexia but also a binge eating disorder, so much so that she had ruptured her stomach on numerous occasions from gorging. She went from starvation to stomach rupture in this sort of act of oscillating self-hatred and torment uncontrollably. And she said she was an alien. She felt like an alien in her own body. Has anyone ever felt like an alien in their own body? So what I'm getting at here is that in a very important way, we also cling to some of ourselves with attachment, and we can't let go. Some bits of ourselves we hate or abhor or resent or reject and wish they weren't there. And other bits we just don't understand. We don't have a clue who we are or what we're doing after all these years of trying to. So in a really interesting way, we have this friend, enemy and stranger constellation operating in relation to our own self. And there's a huge struggle involved there because self-denigration, for example, has anyone got self-denigration? Does anyone put themselves down? It's a remarkable audience here tonight, or attendance. There's really very few emotional problems. Sometimes if you put yourself down, you do it with such force that it's dreadful. You can actually destroy your ability to seize an opportunity in life because at that very moment of operating to reach it and embrace it, you turn on yourself, attack yourself, and disintegrate. What is going on in those moments of self-attack, self-worth? Or we aggrandise ourselves. We pump ourselves up so pompously, so ridiculously, that we become a comical kind of character that's totally out of touch with the reality of who and what we are. We've gone to the other extreme. So pick those aspects in ourselves and do the meditation, and then try to unify them, saying they're all essential parts of me, that to be reabsorbed in some holistic way, if you like. We can kind of reclaim the energy. So I'm not saying we have to cultivate our negative self as somehow our friend, but that we have to try to develop a more expansive view of ourself that can begin to work with our negative components from a position of clarity and accommodation, of love, in other words. We have to be able to start to self-care. And so meditation does acknowledge that we start with ourselves, we start with self-care, and then on that basis we're then able to start caring for others. So we'll finish on that point, but we'll just give away any benefits of the night in the form of a dedication. So just thinking that we might have the opportunity of softening the three categories of friend, enemy and stranger, begin to work with them more creatively and begin to see the people who are behind those categories. Empathise with them. So thank you very much.